When a plaintiff files a civil lawsuit, they often need a way to ensure the defendant's assets do not disappear before the trial ends. In Philippine civil litigation, a provisional remedy shuts down a party's control over their property, freezing it in place while the case proceeds. The rules of court provide a specific list of these remedies, from Rules 57 through 61. Litigators can apply for a preliminary attachment, injunction, receivership, replevin, or support. But if you read those rules closely, you will find a distinct omission. The equitable remedy known as a deposit in court does not appear anywhere in that statutory list. Despite its absence from Rules 57 to 61, trial courts routinely grant motions to deposit. They do this by invoking Section 5G and Section 6 of Rule 135. Rule 135 outlines the inherent powers of a court. It allows a judge to amend and control court processes to make them conformable to law and justice, and to employ auxiliary writs to carry their jurisdiction into effect. This creates a procedural loophole. A standard Rule 57 preliminary attachment requires strict proof that a debtor committed fraud. A motion to deposit under Rule 135 bypasses that fraud requirement entirely, offering a faster route to seize assets. To prevent litigators from exploiting this bypass, the Supreme Court of the Philippines had to step in and define exactly when a deposit order is a valid exercise of inherent power. By comparing two defining decisions, the 2019 Lorenzo Shipping case and the 2022 Guerrero estate case, we can identify the exact boundary between a valid equitable remedy and a grave abuse of judicial discretion. We see the scale of operations in the first case looking at this industrial port. Lorenzo Shipping Corporation operated inter-island vessels moving massive volumes of cargo. The dispute involved three separate entities. There was Lorenzo Shipping, a cargo handling contractor named Cascor, and a subcontractor named Florencio Villarin. Lorenzo Shipping executed a cargo handling contract directly with Cascor. Independently, Cascor's president signed a Memorandum of Agreement to subcontract those operations to Villarin. This arrangement left a critical gap. There was zero contractual privity between the shipping company, LSC, and the subcontractor, Villarin. When Cascor failed to remit Villarin's share of the proceeds, Villarin filed a lawsuit against Cascor for specific performance. He also impleaded LSC as a nominal defendant. Villarin filed a motion asking the trial court to require LSC to deposit 10.2 million pesos into the court's custody. This amount represented LSC's unpaid account to Cascor. Earlier in the litigation, Villarin had already secured a writ of preliminary attachment against Cascor, but both Cascor and LSC posted counterbonds to lift the garnishment. The motion to deposit served as a secondary tactic to circumvent the counterbond and achieve the asset freeze without meeting the strict requirements of Rule 57. The trial court granted the motion. It ordered LSC to place its corporate funds into a joint account under court control, despite the absence of any proven fraud by LSC. LSC appealed the order. The Supreme Court recognized this maneuver as an unauthorized third writ of attachment and struck it down. In resolving the Lorenzo case, the Supreme Court established a two-category framework for all future Rule 135 deposits. Category 1 covers resignation of interest. The depositor relinquishes any claim to funds placed in court custody. Category 2 applies when a depositor receives a stream of funds from a non-party during a trial. The court holds these receipts until determining the entitled party. LSC failed the Category 1 test. The shipping company never resigned its interest in the 10.2 million pesos, and it actively contested any liability to Villarin. LSC also failed the Category 2 test. The money targeted by the deposit order was LSC's own corporate capital, not an incoming stream of third-party rent or payments. This brings us back to the privity test. Because Villarin had no contract with LSC, the trial court possessed no legal jurisdiction to reach across the divide and isolate LSC's independent assets. The Supreme Court noted that while Rule 135 grants broad authority, a deposit order must be a fair response to the equities of the situation. It cannot be used to bypass the rigid statutory requirements for preliminary attachment. The Lorenzo deposit was struck down because it attempted to freeze static corporate property belonging to an entity completely detached from the plaintiff's contract. 3 years later, the Supreme Court addressed this doctrine in the 2022 Guerrero estate case, shifting from maritime shipping to urban real estate in Parañaque. This dispute centered on a landowner, Guerrero Estate Development Corporation, and a real estate developer, Leviste and Guerrero Realty Corporation. The two entities executed a joint venture contract. LGRC constructed a warehouse on GEDCR's property, and they agreed to split the resulting rental income, with 45% going to the landowner. For over 2 decades, LGRC remitted that share. Then, following an offer to terminate the joint venture, LGRC abruptly stopped sending the payments. Instead of filing for a preliminary attachment, GEDCR filed a motion to deposit, asking the trial court to direct LGRC to place the ongoing 45% share of the warehouse rent into court custody. To determine if this was a valid use of Rule 135, the Supreme Court evaluated the facts against the Category 2 standard established in Lorenzo. First, did the order target third-party funds? Yes. LGRC was regularly receiving monthly rent from an independent non-party lessee, Lambert Williams Logistics, who occupied the warehouse. The Supreme Court then applied the second part of the Category 2 test. Did a juridical tie exist between the party holding the funds and the party requesting the deposit? The link was undeniable. GEDCor and LGRC were directly bound by the joint venture contract, and they had a proven 20-year history of distributing the specific rental income in question. The Guerrero deposit was upheld. It succeeded because it targeted a continuous stream of incoming third-party payments tethered to the plaintiff by a formal contract. Placing these two cases side by side reveals how the court distinguishes a valid equitable remedy from a procedural abuse. In Lorenzo Shipping, the plaintiff targeted the defendant's own corporate funds with no underlying privity of contract. The Supreme Court voided the order. In Guerrero Estate, the plaintiff targeted incoming third-party rent directly governed by an active joint venture contract. The Supreme Court ruled the order valid. The legal distinction is clear. The inherent power of the court under Rule 135 is designed to preserve money in motion. It is not an instrument for appropriating a defendant's static assets. If a litigator attempts to freeze a corporate bank account without proving the strict elements of fraud required by Rule 57, filing a motion to deposit is a procedural trap. In the gap between statutory rules and equitable remedies, privity of contract dictates the boundary. Without that direct juridical tie, a court's inherent power cannot reach the asset.